to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the United Nations, which is sort of the epicenter of the world in dealing with major problems such as climate change, migration, diseases, moving aircrafts, ships, mail, weather information, and a variety of other services. My guest is an expert on this topic. Steve Schlesinger is a fellow at the Century Foundation in New York City. Mr. Schlesinger authored Act of Creation, Founding of the United Nations. He is an expert on the United Nations and international issues. Steve, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. You've written so much, and you're so prolific. I'm going to have to mention your website here. So if people would like to get more information, they can go to www.stephenschlesinger.com to get an update on all of the ongoings, and there are just a whole myriad of ongoings. But let's jump right into it. The United Nations is the epicenter of the world to a large degree. It brings 193 countries of the world together to hopefully deal with their problems peacefully and not on the battlefield. That's the way they did in World War I, World War II. And of course, it came out of the ashes of World War II and President Franklin Roosevelt's leadership to a large degree. But talk about the UN of today. It's certainly not the UN of 1945. And what are two or three of the major issues, are the most important? They're all important, but most important issues the UN's wrestling with right now.
Okay, I'll take that in two parts. First of all, yes, UN today is far different from what the organization was back in 1945 when it was established, when it only had 50 nations which were members. Today has 193. And in addition to that, has literally dozens of agencies that have spun off from the original body in order to handle the world's problems. It comes down to that very issue, that there's not just one problem, which is what it originally addressed, which was security. It's now, aviation, it's transportation, it's health, it's migration. And for every one of those issues, there is a specialized agency, which is part of the UN and does dwell and focus on handling those very vital issues that most countries can't handle on their own. And of course, that's the reason why the UN is pervasive around the world, because it does cross borders and it does have international scope. And that's why it can be so helpful to 193 different countries. Now, on the issues of today, surely, I think the issue of global destabilization through crises is a critical one. We're seeing that now in the Middle East on the Gaza crisis. We're seeing it in the Ukraine crisis, which has been going on for almost 3 years now. We have it in all the huge migration issues that are facing every continent on the planet. Mm-hmm. And of course, I would ask to the migration and destabilization, the climate crisis, which the UN has rightly addressed, particularly under our President, Secretary General Guterres, and trying to rivet the attention of the countries around the globe that they've got to do something about bringing down the kinds of fuels and other man-made creations that are warming up this planet at a very dangerous degree.
Exactly. And when we talk about all these problems, the war in Ukraine, the horrific conflict going on in the Gaza and that type of thing, it seems like so often we forget climate change. Climate change is still the number one crisis that we're dealing with. And I think the UN's got another major conference, what they call the Conference of Parties, COP29 meeting in Azerbaijan later this year, to bring the countries of the world together to deal with this problem, because it has to be dealt with internationally. The U.S. can't defeat it. Mexico can't defeat it. You've got to work together, which is so critical. Well, there's so many issues that are out there. And of course, like you mentioned, the UN has that family of agencies that not only like the World Health Organization help deal with pandemics and that type of thing, or UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, teaming up with Rotary International to eliminate the scourge of war, or the scourge of polio. But it's got those other agencies to help move aircraft, ships, mail, and weather information around the globe. Now, there's going to be another major conference, the Summit of the Future, that Secretary Guterres has set up, and it's going to be in late September. What is the purpose of that Summit of the Future, and what should we hope would come out of it?
Well, the UN is now entering, in fact, it's celebrating its 80th year this year. And there's been terrific discussion at the organization about, are we doing the right thing? Is the creation of the UN back in 1945 satisfactory for the issues we face today? And I think there's a feeling that somehow the governance of the UN needs to be reconsidered or reconstructed or reviewed, that it's not handling the issues the way it should be. And so there was, out of this Guterres's idea of a common agenda, came the idea of setting up a pact for the future, which was the notion that you have a summit, which will be held in I believe, in September 24th and 25th of this year, to talk about how can we reconsider the UN structure as it exists today in order to make it more amenable, more productive, more creative in dealing with the issues that we are facing not in 1945, but in 2024. And by the way, I got the dates wrong. It's September 22nd to 23rd. That's the date that the conference will be taking place. And so there are 5 different areas that the summit will address, and the 193 countries, members states of the United Nations, will try to deal with. And of course, they can't just deal with it in 2 days. They've already been considering this issue starting back in January, and they recently had a meeting in Nairobi to come up with some draft ideas. They've come up with, I believe, some 58 action initiatives, which are part of this pact of the future. And one of them is facing the issue of the financial structure for the world. Clearly, the International Monetary Fund, which is part of the UN, and the World Bank, again, another sub-organization to the UN, have done woman's work, but they haven't been able to solve the problem of poverty around the world. So how can we refurbish these 2 organizations in a way that broadens their ability to prop up poor countries and save the populations of impoverished peoples around the globe? In fact, just to throw out a consideration, part of this is this Sustainable Development Goals, which have been talked about and pioneered by the UN over the last decade. This is the notion that by 2030, we cut in half poverty around the world. But right now, in 2024, the feeling is we're only going to get about 15% of those SDGs accomplished by 2030, because there's been too much sluggishness on the part of the member states. So that is the big issue, the whole issue of the financial structure of the world. A second one is, of course, the international peace and security issue, which has focused around a new agenda for peace. This is the notion that how can the UN start in a much more vital and vigorous way preventing these wars from breaking out that we see in Ukraine and Gaza, and Syria, and other hotspots around the globe. This is an issue which, of course, we see the failures of the organization. I mean, it has had triumphs along the way. It has done considerable work in settling small conflicts in places like Guatemala or Cambodia or Cyprus, countries of which, if they hadn't settled those battles and conflicts, it might have spun out of control into a world war. So that's a very important part of what the UN has accomplished in the last 80 years. But what can we do about the current crises, and how can we prevent them in the future? So that's number 2. Number 3 is the whole digital arena. how do you control this runaway artificial intelligence and the cyberspace and all these kind of new inventions that go past barriers and borders and can wreak havoc on countries that don't have defenses against them, and yet are very important for technological advancement in these very same states. So that's a whole nother issue, a third issue. A fourth is the youth. You know, what do you do about the issue of children around the world? Right now, UNICEF is estimating that it's almost 2 billion children at risk in terms of poverty, impoverishment, and you know, without having the sustenance to live. So and facing diseases that are uncontrollable. That is frankly equally important as the other ones I've talked about. Finally, how do you reorganize the UN itself to be more proactive and be more expansive and more agile in handling every one of these signal important issues that the world is grappling with? And so that is the notion behind this pact of the future. And it's really crucial to the future of whether the UN can survive for yet another 80 years.
It certainly is. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes, but after we do the mid show. But one suggestion that I would make, and of course, the UN's not a one world government. It cannot raise taxes on its own and that type of thing. But the 193 countries that come to the UN, they do have control over their tax laws, financing of their institutions and what have you. And we've seen the income inequality in this world is growing at just a Grand Canyon pace. It is going completely out of sight. And a large part of that is because the ultra rich do not pay their fair share of taxes. That's not a political statement. That's a fact of life. And if we get these folks to pay just a small amount more, you will see that there will be money to do a lot that we can't do now, such as properly fund schools and health systems and roads and that type of thing. But we're going to talk about all that in just a minute. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, please check into our website. Also, if you have a podcast or you're involved with an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at an institution that impacts all 8.2 billion people on the planet, and that is the United Nations. My guest today is an expert on the UN, is Mr. Steve Schlesinger. Steve, we've talked about so many, I think there are 5 points that you're trying to accomplish in the Summit of the Future, and they're all very, very important and vital to prosperity and really health and happiness of people all around the world. But as you look at the United Nations, what do you think, what can be done to, first off, help people better understand the United Nations, and secondly, work to promote changes in the UN? You mentioned that the UN of today is not the UN of 1945, and it isn't. There's no company out there that's the same today as it was in 1945. But how can we help get people to learn more about the UN, and then how can the UN reform itself, make changes to be more effective?
You know, this is a very important point because, and I feel this particularly as an American, because in the United States, the UN has a kind of up and down reputation. It's not considered as important to most Americans as our foreign policy or, you know, vital issues within the 50 states and so on. While around the rest of the globe, the UN is, I think, a much more prestigious organ in terms of what what the people of the globe think that it does. And I think so first of all, I think it's important that the UN itself somehow promote what it's doing on a more expansive basis. Now, there is a prohibition in the organization where it's not really supposed to advertise itself, even though it's part of everybody's lives. And I think it's very important, therefore, particularly in my country, the United States, that there be more attention paid both in the media and by the Washington establishment. I note that since 1945, there's only been one president who's even mentioned the United Nations in his inaugural address, and that was John F. Kennedy in 1961. So it's not part of the lingo, so to speak, the political lingo of American leaders. Around the world, the UN, as I said, is much more revered, and there's much more attention paid to it. There are a lot more foreign correspondents here in New York covering the organization than there are correspondents from American newspapers covering the UN. And so it's very important that not only the media transports or transfers the information about the organization, but local groups within each country and my own country talk about what the UN is doing for their livelihoods. Now, we have the model UNs here, which are in high schools and colleges around the United States. There are similar organizations in countries around the globe. We need more of that. We need more attention paid by local communities in helping foster interest in this really unrivaled organization. And so I think that's a very important part of how the UN is going to survive in the future. Now, as for reforms in the UN itself, that's a very difficult question, because the biggest reform issue facing the UN is the Security Council. As we all know, there's only 5 countries that have the veto in the Security Council: the United States, China, Russia, Great Britain, and France. And that was the way the structure was built back in 1945. Of course, today we have many more countries that I would consider major powers, whether you're talking about India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, and so on. Question is, shouldn't we broaden the number of big countries who have the veto right on the Security Council, and maybe even make the Security Council bigger so it's more reflective of the power realities of today? But that reform issue, which has been brought up every year at the UN, never seems to go anywhere. And the frank reason for that is the 5 countries that have the veto have the right to prevent any change, and they don't really want to have any change because they're perfectly happy with the pedestals they're sitting on at this point. So that's issue of reform, which is very vital, I think, in the future if we're going to make this organization responsive to the globe in the coming years. A second one is, where's the General Assembly? What role can it play? Right now, when a General Assembly passes a resolution, it's not binding on the member states, whereas in the Security Council, any edict passed by the Security Council is automatically binding on all 193 countries. How do we give more power to the General Assembly? How do we make sure that it plays a more proactive role? Now, we can't turn this organization into a world democracy. That would never be accepted to all the sovereign nations in this globe. But we can certainly try to, in some ways, reinforce the influence, the moral influence, as well as the practical influence of the organization through the General Assembly. So a lot of reform could take place there. And there's many other reforms. How do you keep the peacekeeping operations going? We've had problems with them in the past. Sometimes they've been involved in illegal activities when they go into a country to keep the peace, or they have spread disease in places like Haiti. I mean, they don't mean to. They don't want to be doing these kind of things, but you can't control everything. No military force is pure. So how do you bring measures of discipline to the peacekeeping operations. I could go on, but those are the principal ones.
Those are excellent ideas, and I think you're absolutely right. And one suggestion that I would make, well, you were talking about the visibility of the UN. One of the reasons Americans don't realize how the UN touches their lives is because they don't think about it. If you're flying a Delta flight someplace, going internationally, or you drop a letter in the mailbox going to Tokyo, or you take a cruise in the Caribbean or on the Mediterranean, or the Atomic Energy Agency is trying to hold Iran back from developing nuclear capabilities, we don't hear about them. The UN affects our lives every day, but the people in the developing countries see the UN in action. They see UNICEF and the World Health Organization working with Rotary International to eliminate polio. They see that there are UN agencies on the front lines in Ukraine to keep the Ukrainians alive, even when the Security Council was partially paralyzed. So that is the challenge they have. But I think you're right. The UN needs to advertise it more and do it in a form of promoting information, not propaganda about the UN. The UN's not perfect, but it's absolutely critical and essential. But Steve, I can't believe we're out of time, but I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.